Good afternoon. Welcome to the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Today is a collaborative event between the Global Food Security Project here at CSIS and the World Food Center at the University of California in Davis. My name is Kimberly Flowers, and I'm the Director of Food Security here at CSIS. And before we begin, just a quick safety announcement. Not that we expect any issues, but if something occurs, know that I'm your safety officer, and I will direct you toward the exits. First and foremost, I want to thank Dr. Josette Lewis from UC Davis, who many of you in this room probably know. From the conception of the idea of this event, as well as pulling together the best experts, Josette deserves a great deal of credit, and it's been a real joy to work with her. So thank you so much, Josette. For those of you that are here today, whether you're here because you care about ending hunger or improving agricultural development or preserving our environment, you know that you need to care about water. There's a gap between our supply and demand of this finite resource, and water is critical to the food production, the health, and the life of us and our planet. As Jacques Cousteau said, we forget that the water cycle and the life cycle are one. Today, you're going to hear from a variety of experts on topics ranging from water scarcity to irrigation to water policy reforms, as well as groundwater management. To help us frame this discussion, we'll begin with remarks from Dr. Josette Lewis. Josette has spent her career working in agricultural research and development with experience both in the public and the private sector. I first met Josette when she was at the U.S. Agency for International Development. She worked there for 16 years, including as the director of the Office of Agriculture. 3 years ago, she launched the World Food Center at UC Davis, who many know is one of the most top-ranked universities in the world for agricultural research. The World Food Center is combining science with innovation and policymaking to help improve the planet's food system. Josette?
Thank you, Kimberly, and let me also say thanks to you and to CSIS for co-hosting this event today. Many of you know I left my career here in Washington, D.C. for the better climate of California, but it's also why we are back here today to talk about an issue that we know very deeply as we conclude our 5th year of drought in California. Next week is the start of something we call the water year in California, reflecting the fact that almost all of the precipitation in our Mediterranean climate occurs during a limited time in the cooler parts of the year. And ironically, as I was getting up yesterday to prepare to come here, I was awoken by the sound of the burst of a rain coming down, which is kind of early in the year for us. And I thought, well, maybe this is a good omen for what our water year is going to look like this year. But then I did what probably most of us did after we get up, is I checked my email. And the daily blog from our State Department of Food and Agriculture was an article that was just published by a team of researchers at UCLA saying that drought might be the new normal in California, and that we may be looking at decades-long, if not millennium-long drought, which is something that has occurred in the history of that part of the United States. So whether I put my faith in omens or I put my faith in science, we'll see what the water year holds for California. Water is required for food production, and food production is probably the most water-intensive industry that we have. The World Economic Forum ranks water as the top global risk in terms of potential impact. And what makes water so complex is it's not only essential for food production, but it also underpins progress on many of the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals. So there's a lot of conflicting needs and demands with respect to water. But water is a significant driver of food security. Irrigated agriculture is twice as productive as rain-fed. Irrigation often allows a second growing season. And in many parts of the world, the dry season is known as the hunger season. So irrigation can play a role in addressing seasonal hunger. Further, something we know from California that produces almost half of the fruits and vegetables in the US food supply, some of the most nutritious crops, like fruits, vegetables, dairy, are the most water-intensive crops. So the introduction of irrigation can be very important to achieving better dietary diversity and nutritional outcomes. While over 40% of the cropland in Asia is irrigated, less than 5% of crops in Africa are. So we have a lot of opportunity with respect to improving food security through irrigation. And we know from looking across a number of countries in Asia and Africa in particular that poverty is generally lower in irrigated areas. So I need a little help with a slide here. I'm not sure how that part works. I do have a few visuals, which will illustrate this point about the link between poverty and irrigation. Next one. There we go. So maybe lower the lights up here. So this data is from the early 2000s, some analyses that, it's a little hard to see with the lights on, but if you look across a number of countries, Ethiopia, Bangladesh, parts of India, Sri Lanka, and other parts of Southeast Asia, you can see that the rates of poverty show areas. So a very compelling set of facts with respect to the power of water to improve food security. Irrigation is also a very important buffer to changing weather. The broadest impacts of climate change on agriculture will be felt through changes in rainfall. Next slide, please. This is work from the World Bank that shows explanation that the darker red is where those changes will be much more substantial, all with lower levels of surface runoff into the future. The World Bank, as the World Bank puts it in their recent report, water is to climate adaptation as energy is to mitigation. That underscores the importance of water in adapting to changing climates. And in the bank's recent report on the impact of water on economic growth, they single out the risk to economic growth in regions such as sub-Saharan Africa and South Asia, due primarily to the significant role that agriculture still plays in those regions in the economy and in poverty reduction. Among the sources of water for our planet, groundwater in particular plays an important role in buffering agriculture during drought, climate shocks such as drought. And we see this very clearly in California, where groundwater withdrawals increase during periods of drought. Next slide, please. This is from our State Department of Water Resources. The periods of drought are shown there in brown, and you can see the depth of the water table, shown as the blue line, declines significantly during each period of drought, particularly as agriculture has relied on groundwater to sustain production during periods of drought when surface water is not available. Globally, irrigation accounts for about 70% of groundwater withdrawals. That's the positive side. Recent estimates are in Africa that there's about 100 times more supply of groundwater than surface water. So there's some resources that we could tap to improve agricultural productivity and food security in Africa. But as important as irrigation and groundwater are to the future of food security, the challenge of sustainably managing those resources does not provide easy solutions. The net withdrawals of surface and groundwater already exceed supply in water-stressed regions of South Asia, the Middle East, and North Africa. 60% of the world's populations live in these water basins. According to the World Resources Institute, almost 30% of food production occurs in regions of high or extremely high water stress, with over half of the world's irrigated agriculture in those regions. While groundwater has buffered the impact of the drought in California, we have been over-withdrawing those water bank accounts. If I give the next slide. Again, it's pretty self-evident. These are satellite images which measure the groundwater depth just over the first 3 years of the 5-year drought that we've had in California. And you can see that we are very rapidly depleting the groundwater supply as agriculture tries to adapt to this climate shock. With the gap between water demand and supply already stressed, there's little reserve to meet rising competition from water among urban, energy, and environmental sectors. As we've seen in California over the last 5 years, with our surface water system, where we have probably the most extensive infrastructure in the world in the form of reservoirs and canals and pumping stations to move water over great distances, to collect and move. When water is stressed, as it's been over the last 5 years, agriculture loses out in the race for water allocation. So water is essential to food production, and we cannot just see agriculture as the problem because of its large water footprint. With that background, I'll turn it over to the panel to discuss these issues in more detail and hopefully to offer opportunities for investment to meet the challenges of securing water for food in the future. Thank you.
One of the points that I found most intriguing from Josette's remarks was that the World Economic Forum listed water as one of the top global risks in terms of impact. I don't think we think about that enough. For our panel today, we're going to start with Dr. Mark Rosegrant. And at the International Food Policy Research Institute, many of you know it as IFPRI, Mark leads a team of researchers and an analyst to look at natural resources and agriculture policy. And pun intended, water issues tend to surface to the top as some of the major threat to our food supply and health. Mark is a prolific and award-winning author, and we have a lot to learn from him. So Mark, please talk to us, teach me about water scarcity, policy reform, and how that relates to food security.
Yeah, thanks very much, Kimberly. So Josette has already introduced some of the big issues here facing us in terms of increasing water scarcity in the future, increasing variability in water, and the implications of that for food security as well. Some of the key challenges that are driving that increasing water scarcity are first of all, the increasing cost of developing new water and delivering that new water to consumers, whether in the urban area, industry, or agriculture. So the supply of usable water has been growing very slowly. At the same time, while supply is stagnant, there's wasteful use of the existing supplies, which heavily encouraged by subsidies and distortive incentives. So the farmers have really no reason in much of the world to reduce water use since they get it more or less for free. That contributes to, with other policies, to depletion of groundwater, growing water pollution, and declining water quality throughout the world, which of course also then reduces the productivity and usability of that water. Then on top of that is climate change and extreme weather, which you've already heard about. So there's a lot of things that need to be done to try to head towards a water secure future. I'll touch on 6 points very quickly. I think the first is that a big part of the solution in the water sector is actually going to be somewhat outside of that sector. In fact, it's in investment in crop breeding to generate better yields per unit of water as well as per unit of land. There's still significant potential in plant breeding to increase the amount of usable biomass per unit of water through more efficient transpiration and more efficient use of that biomass through, per unit of transpiration. It's not easy. There's a lot of challenges to that breeding, but bringing together the top tools in biotechnology combined with conventional breeding, it's possible. So we're looking at things like breeding for drought tolerance, salinity tolerance, heat tolerance, nitrogen use efficiency as well. Some of the keys to biotechnology are things like marker-assisted selection, cell and tissue culture, and it's going to be very important to have gene editing developed now in ways that it's not held back in the ways that genetically modified organisms have been. There's a big challenge in the regulatory systems now to see if gene editing, which is not transgenic, can actually be regulated in a rational form. A second area then is more rapid adoption of new irrigation technology, including such things as, of course, drip and sprinkler irrigation, but also combined with farm management like precision farming and conservation agriculture. There's a lot of developments actually in small-scale precision agriculture in developing countries as well, places like India and China and Southeast Asia, where it's not the huge tractors that you see in the US, but smaller-scale tractors combined with small-scale sensors and operating systems to deliver nutrients and water where they're best usable. I think one thing that has to be pointed out, though, is that these technologies are adopted by farmers really because they increase their income, their labor saving, and they lower their own costs, pumping costs. But in real life, these kinds of technologies have to be, to get overall savings in water and food security, have to be combined with appropriate water rights and water trading systems. Otherwise, those technologies often can just lead to greater use of water for the farmers who've adopted them, so they divert water that would otherwise go downstream to other farmers. So they actually can be disequilibrating and negative in terms of their income effects, unless we can get reform of the management systems as well. In particular, that leads us to an extremely important step, and perhaps to me the most fundamental, the need for establishment of firm water rights that really entitle farmers and other water users to their right without risk of appropriation or diversion without compensation. These water rights then should be moved towards tradability, first on voluntary water tradability, but then moving as you develop further into effective market-based approaches. That gives the kinds of incentives that are needed for farmers to economize in water and also to gain from income from that trading and that economies. It's going to be very difficult to do that. I'm not saying this is an easy step. We see even in places like California, water trading is tough to do. In the developing countries where we work at IFPRI, it's even more difficult. There's high costs of measuring and monitoring water use because you're talking about large systems with many small farmers. Long-standing cultural practices and religious beliefs that water should be treated as a free good are an issue. Because that water is treated as a free good, it tends to end up being water is cheap for rich people connected to the best parts of the irrigation system and the pipe systems in the cities. Small consumers in the cities buy water from trucks at a very high price, and farmers downstream from the top don't get enough water. So getting past that, and I think the other thing that has to be mentioned is that the current systems are supported by entrenched political interests, the irrigation bureaucracies, in which there's also a lot of corruption and income to be gained by how they allocate water. A third area, and I'm actually not going to talk about this as we're going to hear a real expert, is the need to translate these kinds of policies to better groundwater governance, but I'll leave that for Thomas to speak about. The other place, it's not just about water quantity allocation, it's increasingly about water quality allocation and associated environmental problems. We need to address those much better. You're seeing rapid increases in industrial effluents and poorly treated domestic and industrial sewage, but also a very rapid increase that some studies we've shown recently of runoff from fertilizer and pesticides in agriculture areas. These are things that have to be addressed. That's going to require, again, investment in water quality monitoring, get standards in place, incorporate the water quality issue into the water rights systems, and enforce. And this is, this is so trivial, but it's absolutely essential. These have to be, these quality standards have to be enforced. A lot of countries have good systems in place on paper, but you're not getting the people out in the field to actually monitor and support those kinds of standards. So you need to work on polluters paying for their pollution and other incentives in place on costs at the point of pollution. That's going to have to be required to be combined with additional investments. And one thing, I think that there's been essentially a period we've been through where the feeling is that hard infrastructure investment, for example, in irrigation systems is not possible anymore. It's too costly, and there's environmental issues involved. But I think we've reached a point where we are going to have to do careful new investments in irrigation as well as in water supply in urban areas. Josette pointed out the extremely low amount of irrigation in Africa, about 5% of crop area. We've done a study at IFPRI in collaboration with the World Bank showing that there's potential for at least 16 million hectares of profitable large-scale irrigation and 50 million hectares of small-scale irrigation in Africa, whereas we're only talking about between 5 and 10 million hectares currently. So there is potential, cost-effective and hydrologically effective and we'll be working with the bank and others to try to dig into more details about how to implement those things. There is potential there as well. In the urban area, estimates like WHO says $23 billion per year to get everybody hooked up to clean water and to proper sewage systems. So there is, in addition to the policy forum, there has to be recommitment to capital investment in this sector. So obviously, this is a very broad picture that I painted, and the actual reforms required for any given country are going to depend on levels of development, agroclimatic conditions, level of agriculture intensification, degree of water competition, and a number of other factors. And the solutions are difficult, but I think they're feasible, but we really have to recommit to these kinds of reforms in the water sector. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mark. Ask them. I encourage you to do the same. The beauty about today's event is we're going to have a lot of time for audience questions for you to engage these experts. So please be thinking of thoughtful questions as we hear from our panelists. Next, we have Dr. Thomas Harder, who is from UC Davis, where he works on water management and policy issues, particularly related to groundwater use. From sustainable management to state and federal regulations, he is the expert when it comes to groundwater. He's an extension specialist, and he has written that if we don't better manage groundwater depletion, future generations are going to suffer real consequences. So, Thomas, we look forward to your remarks.
Thank you, Kimberly. Thank you for having me here. It's an honor. So I'm the groundwater scientist. I'm actually neither an economist nor a policy expert. I'm bringing my science background into this discussion. So let me maybe start with what I see as the take-home message, perhaps for, at least for my part, if not for this entire discussion. One is a recognition that groundwater, even though it's hiding and often seems far away and seems to be undisturbed, as we heard from Josette and from Rob, it is a very critical resource and probably underappreciated in just how critical a resource it is in global food production. As Josette has pointed out, groundwater is really our insurance for dry season production, for production during droughts, and against climate variability and climate change, more so than surface water. So that's the underappreciation of groundwater and the critical role that groundwater plays in food production, I think, is one take-home message. The second take-home message is the understanding that we have of the limitations that will come from depleted, degraded groundwater quality resources, the assessment of that understanding is currently very limited, and I think this is one of the most underappreciated and underassessed risks we have in global food production. Understanding that role that groundwater plays in the security of food production. And then the third take-home message is playing into the points that Rob made. This is a complex problem. This is not something that can be fixed with engineering solutions that can be fixed by throwing a lot of money at it. This is a problem that needs international, national, state, and local engagement across these scales, across disciplines, between sciences, social sciences, and policies. This is a very integrated, the approach to tackling this is very integrated, and there's nothing straightforward about it. So those are my 3 take-home messages. So let me kind of take this apart a little bit further, and I like to start most of my talks, being a groundwater scientist, with what the hell is groundwater anyway? And depending on my audience, I use many different analogies, but one of my favorite ones is, many of you, maybe not all of you, and maybe this is because I'm from California, we do eat cereals. And we eat cereal in the morning, and a nice analogy for a groundwater aquifer is your cereal bowl. You put your cereal in your bowl, and you pour the milk into the cereal, and the milk disappears in the cereal. It fills these pore spaces between your granola, right? That's what groundwater is. And many of our large groundwater basins are just like that. They're big granola bowls that hold loose sediments that take up water. And so with that, groundwater actually has many roles given to us by nature. It's a huge reservoir. It's bigger in California, and I speak mostly from my California perspective. In California and globally, it's a bigger reservoir than all of our surface water reservoir combined. And it holds reserves that far exceed what we're storing in surface water reservoirs without ever having built a dam. That's one role that groundwater plays, being this milk in the granola bowl. The other role that it plays, at least locally, is it's a transport system. To the degree that I'm lowering water table in one place, pump it out, water comes flowing towards that place from somewhere else without me putting a pipeline in. So the groundwater system, on the scale of a few miles, maybe a few tens of miles at the most, can actually work as a transport system. And then the third important function of groundwater is that it is a partial, it's not a complete, but it's a partial filter which plays an important role in water quality. In the United States, most groundwater is served without much treatment other than chlorination, whereas all surface water that we serve in the United States as drinking water goes through major treatment. So those are the 3 major roles of groundwater. And to the degree that groundwater is a local resource, that is also perhaps one of its pitfalls. Thinking of it as a local resource makes it a local problem and not something that we need to think of on a global scale. Groundwater being a common pool resource, meaning a resource that many have access to with comparatively little technology and financial investment when compared to the efforts that go into building a surface water reservoir, an irrigation canal system throughout a water district, having to buy water from the district, having to deal with when water comes in on a surface water system, having to schedule that water delivery. Groundwater is much easier. You put a hole in the ground. If you have the money to put that hole in the ground, you pump that water out whenever it's convenient for me as a farmer. And so that access, that common access to groundwater makes it subject to what we call the tragedy of the commons. We all use it, and we use it, first of all, to our benefit, and as long as the neighbor does the same thing, I have no incentive to do what seems to make more sense, which is to actually look at the resource and see at long-term perspectives. Being what it is, it's therefore not surprising that groundwater has become this very central factor in food production. 20% of global agricultural production happens irrigated lands, those irrigated lands produce 40% of all agricultural products, almost half of agricultural production. Of those irrigated lands, about 40% are irrigated partially or entirely by groundwater. In groundwater playing primarily the role of an insurance, as I said, dry season, irrigation supply, drought supply, and climate variability supply. Large amounts of cereal production in China and South Asia depend on groundwater irrigation. Globally, about 10 to 15% of food production right now depends on already declining groundwater resources. So, speaking to the consequences of that, it is first a decline in groundwater resources, with the most immediate impact being that farmers end up with higher pumping costs because they have higher water lifts. Then wells go dry. There's the cost of redrilling a new well. There are enormous social inequalities associated with access to that capital to drill these new wells. The poorest and economically most disadvantaged are usually losing out in this local competition for this common pool resource if there is not a strong water rights system in place. But beyond just the lowering of the water table, we have other consequences, land subsidence. If you're in coastal regions, we have seawater intrusion that essentially comes in as the aquifer system makes space, sort of invites that seawater to come in as we're drawing our fresh water out. We have water quality degradation due to salinization of aquifers under irrigated systems, which is another long-term risk to that resource. And we have continued disconnection of groundwater from surface water. Groundwater is an important source for many streams and lakes, especially out here in the more temperate climates. And out in the Southwest, when streams flow, and not flow from a dam, but they naturally flow 2 weeks or 3 weeks after a rainfall, that's because groundwater is feeding those streams. And we're losing those connections between groundwater and streams, with consequences to ecosystems that are supported by these streams and lakes. So California has reacted to these threats, being now in a third serious drought in the last 15 years. We've had a 2-year drought in the early 2000s, a 3-year drought in the late 2000s, and are now in a 5th year of drought since 2012. As I learned, there's nothing like a crisis to make changes, and we've established the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. California has gone from one of the few states that doesn't actually have a Groundwater Management Act, but does have a very strong legal system to protect groundwater users if they choose to go to court, to a state that has essentially assembled a very modern legislation, and much that incorporates, as I come to see it, as I'm learning about management recommendations, incorporates many of the recommendations that have been made elsewhere in the fundamental principles in which it enacts that legislation. There's 2 principles that the legislation is based on. One is that management has to be sustainable. The management of the resource has to be done in a manner that allows future generations to enjoy that resource in the same ways we enjoy that resource today. That's one principle. And it's more specifically outlined as not having a declining water level, not having seawater intrusion, not having land subsidence, not impacting streams and lakes, and not having water quality degradation. The other principle is that the management shall happen locally. The management authority is given to local agencies that have yet to be created, and we have a timeline of June 2017 to create probably on the order of 200 to 300 local groundwater sustainability agencies. An enormous administrative effort by local governments, water districts, counties, and cities to create these groundwater sustainability agencies, which are given fairly broad authorities in managing, distributing, and curtailing groundwater use. These agencies are then given 5 years to generate what we call a groundwater sustainability plan. That plan has a number of dimensions. One dimension that needs to be included in that plan is, and Rob spoke to that, there needs to be more measurement, there needs to be monitoring, there needs to be assessment just to understand the resource. Where does water come in? Where does water go out? What is the balance of that resource? Another pillar of sustainability plans is stakeholder engagement. It can't be done in a dark room. It can't be done just by the water district. There has to be an engagement with the land users, with the disadvantaged communities, within a groundwater sustainability agency, with the various stakeholders that are there, an active communication, and that's going to be a very significant part in moving this forward and coming to consensus on how to move forward. Because then the other two things that these agencies will need to do in their plan is they will either have to increase the supply that goes into their aquifers through additional recharge, or they will have to stop the withdrawal at the amount that it's currently being withdrawn of groundwater. Those are their two choices, and those are tough choices to make when there's limited water supplies and limited dollars to do that. So we are setting out on a grand experiment that actually embodies a lot of the recommendations that you will hear from experts on how do we move forward on management, integrated management of groundwater and surface water. There is a significant link to water quality in the sustainable groundwater management in California. And California, unlike the rest of the country, actually has a Clean Water Act that we refer to as the Porter-Cologne Water Quality Control Act that precedes the Clean Water Act by about 3 years and is not only a Clean Surface Water Act, but is also a Clean Groundwater Act. And we are in the process of actually regulating agricultural discharges to groundwater. That includes nitrate discharges, that includes pesticide discharges, and that includes salinity discharges. A major effort that we are just starting to address using very similar principles to those that we're using with the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act. So those are some of the solutions that we're devising. None of those solutions are engineering solutions. All of those solutions engage stakeholders. All of those solutions are looking for facilitation. All of those solutions are looking for a integrative cooperation between local agencies, state agencies, and federal agencies. One thing that I should mention, the key driver in moving Sustainable Groundwater Management Act forward in California is that while local agencies are given the responsibility for groundwater management and to define locally what that groundwater management looks like, what sustainability looks like, and what sustainable groundwater management looks like, we do have the state given the authority to essentially be the one to step in if the local agencies fail. And that's really the driver, especially in agricultural regions which have been very reluctant to engage actively on very difficult decisions. Having the threat of the state coming in and managing your groundwater has at least thus far been a very effective means of actually engaging locals in moving forward on the formation of their groundwater sustainability agencies and thinking about groundwater sustainability plans. I think I'll leave it at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Thomas. So we'll move on to our last panelist, which is Dr. Rob Bertram, who is currently the chief scientist at the U.S. Agency for International Development's Bureau for Food Security. Rob is responsible for having had designed and also advancing the research strategy under Feed the Future. So he combines science and evidence and innovation and with international development programs that are really aimed at ultimately lifting smallholder farmers out of poverty. His focus and background includes climate-smart agriculture, plant breeding, international affairs, and as I learned as I was doing more homework on him, he also has one of his many degrees from UC Davis, so it's fitting that he's part of this panel as well. So Rob, talk to us about the U.S. government's response and the programs that it funds and how it works on water issues, particularly at a time when the U.S. government, as we know, is in the final stages of crafting this new global food security strategy, which is due to Congress October 1st. So thank you, Rob.
Thank you, Kimberly. It's great to be here. And also, I want to thank Thomas for crediting me with some of the brilliant things that Mark said. If you want to be confused with somebody, you can't do better than be confused with Mark Rosgrant. So, so we've heard already now, why water is so central for food security, but also to broader environmental, urban, and the whole suite of development issues that we think about at an agency like USAID. What I want to do is pick up on these points and about how Feed the Future, the whole of government food security initiative, is addressing and integrating water in its thinking, but also, as Kimberly suggests, looking forward now in the wake of the Global Food Security Act, which was signed into law by President Obama, and our strategy is due in a couple weeks to Congress, which codifies the renewal of investment in agriculture food security that started about 8 years ago. And the driver for which is really reduction of poverty, reduction of hunger, and improvement of nutrition as measured by reductions in child stunting. Very high bar, very significant links to water, and I'll say a bit more about that now. The new law is explicit in focusing more strongly on nutrition outcomes and as measured by stunting reduction, but a major new dimension is on the table, and that is the explicit integration of WASH, water, sanitation, and hygiene. It's in the law. So we're mandated to be much more intentional and deliberate in thinking about it than we maybe have been up till now. Key opportunities that I think about, thinking first, for example, in terms of what does agriculture do and how can it make contributions? Well, a key area is hygiene. And because we know that poor hygiene in the household environment or the village is a sure route to environmental enteropathy, reduced absorption of nutrients by small children, and stunting, which is, of course, what we're trying to get at. So we have to think about how to manage livestock and poultry in ways that minimize their negative impacts on the household environment. We think a lot about the multiple uses associated with water investments. We haven't, I think, up till now thought a lot about potable water. I think we'll have to be more intentional about that going forward in working with our colleagues in the WASH community. But also small-scale irrigation for horticultural crops, fodder crops, water for animal agriculture, very big thing in a lot of situations, and of course aquaculture in freshwater situations. So the other thing is that many of these higher value commodities, some of which I just mentioned, also have a lot of hygiene challenges associated with them and take us right to the food safety issue, which is another point of entry in trying to deal with stunting and nutrition outcomes. So all of these opportunities are ways to give a better environment to the growing child, to make those 1,000 days from conception to 2 years old, that critical period that sets you on a course for lifelong health and potential, including intellectual potential, is really critical. But if you look at these opportunities, as I said, they're higher value, they're also higher income potential. They're also higher nutrient density and nutrient diversity, and many of them are gender-friendly to women. And we know that women in food security settings are very much more effective than men in helping ensure outcomes, particularly with respect to the children, but really for the whole family. So we have to think about greater productivity, availability and affordability of high-quality, diverse foods that are so lacking in the diets of the poor, both rural and urban. And it's important to understand that households and communities need to see the benefits of the change. You can't just mandate people to do things. Often, I think people who aren't from our field think that we can be prescriptive about how people should manage their land, labor, and capital, meager as those may be in many instances. They have to be able to see an outcome that works for them. We can't mandate things. But we can invest in research and help offer choices that give them choices that work. And we can do better, very importantly, in the knowledge and information dimension of that. Many of these more demanding, more complex, higher value products and any kind of diversification really is more knowledge and information intensive. But fortunately, we have some new tools on the table, things like cell phone mediated information, other kinds of extension services that are leapfrogging some of the ways that, a country like ours went through with a large-scale public extension service. So thinking creatively, there's a lot of creative thinking going around about that. And the other piece that I would put on table for all of this is the role of social and behavior change communication. We can learn a lot from the health community. And I think that's going to be a key thing. Many of you who know about Feed the Future know about the focus on value chains. Well, I think if we're really going to get the impacts we want in terms of nutrition, and this, especially when we get into diversification and things around, say, greater availability of water, that behavior change communication and the knowledge-intensive aspect of that is going to only grow in importance. So I want to look at another major driver now after nutrition, climate change. Everybody agrees this is a major threat to food security at the global level. It's, as we've heard, it's wrapped up with precipitation, evaporation, and water availability from all sources, including ground sources. And as Josette discussed, water is a huge risk reducer in terms of climate change adaptation. And irrigation, we recognize, is a key means to reduce those risks. But how do we leverage irrigation into the sub-Saharan African context where so much of our work is located? What we have, we've got to have different models. These are not the large-scale Asian models of river basins and major capital investments in canals. I don't think we're talking about that to get at the agroecologies where poverty and stunting are most concentrated. I think we're thinking about sustainable use of groundwater and surface water reserves. And while hydrology overall is not as well developed in Africa as it is elsewhere, there are suggestions that sustainable groundwater resources do exist widely in many parts of Africa that are arable. So, and this development of irrigation is part of a larger challenge that we see, and that is, how do you capitalize undercapitalized systems? These are very undercapitalized systems, and this is not true just about irrigation. Think about mechanization as well. How do we reduce and spread risks and get investment into capital investment into appropriate level technologies? So we have invested in an effort led by Texas A&M University, the Feed the Future Small-Scale Irrigation Lab. It's working with 3 national partners in Africa and the International Water Management Institute of the CGIAR. And it's about using models to better characterize and analyze both risks and potential returns, innovative approaches around service provision, and anything we can do to help reduce risks, understand them, and hence drive investment. And I just thinking about this service provision, I heard a great story in northern Nigeria a year or 2 ago where people can buy these little $20 pumps from China and attach them to their motorbikes, and they can go from farm to farm and pump water using their motorbike engine. And of course, this is only lifting water about 8 or 9 feet, but when you think of the drudgery and the labor involved in trying to lift water 8 or 9 feet for a woman and her 4 kids, I mean, this could be transformational, and it's low cost, and of course, the risk is spread because it's lots of users. Policy is very important. I'm going to talk a little later about a policy change in Bangladesh that was transformational, and many of you may know about it if you know about irrigation. But anyway, key point here, in the smallholder context in sub-Saharan Africa, I don't think just about irrigated fields. That's not what we're talking about. We're talking about reducing risk and opening up new opportunities. For example, a 1/20th of a hectare in a non-staple crop during the dry season, a high-value vegetable. Being able to raise poultry, being able to have more goats, maybe to be able to raise high-quality fodder and hence really drive up the growth trajectory of the animal. And we can think about new techniques and technologies for measuring, for example, water penetration in the soil as well. So while irrigation is a key opportunity, it's really about water management overall, including water conservation and, very importantly, water productivity. And so I want to shift gears a little bit from irrigation to water management on farm. This is key in terms of mitigation and adaptation for climate-smart agriculture, a term we hear a lot about. Much of what we find in climate-smart agriculture, when we do adaptation, we're also doing mitigation because it's organic matter in the soil, makes the crops more resilient, makes drought less of a threat, and hence helps insulate the family from the vagaries of weather. And I want to just mention one set of work done by Professor Sig Snap from Michigan State University in Malawi, where she has developed a doubled-up legume systems in partnership with the national partners there. And the issue of degraded soils, bare soils, and poor soil fertility, poor crop growth. And by integrating doubled-up legumes, a pigeon pea with a groundnut or soy or bean, rotating with the maize, you can triple your maize yields, you can double your protein yield, you can get 2.5 times greater efficiency from your fertilizer, right? Because the organic matter in the soil makes the fertilizer much more effective and efficient in terms of delivering yields. And you can double the ground cover during the year on the soil. And you can raise the profit by about 2.5 times. So this comes back to that issue of, hey, you know, what's in it for me? A lot. And with all that extra biomass, what can you also do? You can integrate goats, you can integrate pigs. And we've got lots of great stories about farmers that have really transformed their lives, built houses, sent their kids to school, bought soap and cooking oil and all kinds of things that we take for granted that are nothing short of revolutionary in those environments. So this is the thing that doesn't get talked about in that story. This is a huge win for water productivity. I mean, it's just rainfall, it's just ambient water, but I mean, this is enormous. So we have to think about this kind of water productivity as well. And this is so successful that the government of Malawi has now picked this up and is extending it across the country to induce and help communities adapt this approach. So it's again, a really great example of research leading to applicable technology, appropriate technologies leading to human outcomes that matter. Another example linked to climate, anything we do in livestock to increase productivity in Africa is climate smart. This is not from me. This is from the Climate Change, Agriculture, and Food Security Program of the CGIAR. Right now, about 95% of animal feed goes to maintenance, not growth, because the animals are in such bad shape. So better quality feed from a little bit of irrigated fodder, some alfalfa, better availability of cleaner water for animals. All of these things matter hugely to a climate smart approach to development. Now, changing gears to South Asia, another global hotspot of extreme poverty and child stunting. I mentioned in Bangladesh years ago there were big tariffs on imported diesel pumps. They took those off, and I don't know if IFPRI was involved in working for that, Mark. I hope they were. That would be a great story to tell. And it's transformational. People invested in bore wells. And this is in an area that floods every year, so we're not depleting the groundwater. It's not like the Punjab where there are big issues around that. This is the other end of the Indo-Gangetic Plains. And they went from 1 crop a year to 2 or 3 crops a year. And those crops are grown in a season where there's more sunshine, less humidity, less disease pressure, and yields are sky high. And again, it's been transformational. And that's why Bangladesh, those of you of a certain age, remember when people thought Bangladesh was going to starve, and it wasn't that long ago that we thought that. That did happen, and this is one of the reasons for it. In climate-smart agriculture, this is the other thing I want to drive home here is it's not necessarily about reducing greenhouse gas footprint, it can also be about bending the curve. By increasing productivity, we can reduce the emissions intensity. Now, there's other cases where we can actually reduce the emissions, and that's true in South Asia. Some of you have heard of alternate wetting and drying of rice. You're pumping less water. That alternate wetting and drying greatly reduces the methane production. It reduces your costs. Another great example is no-till agriculture, conservation agriculture. You're no longer using energy to plow the fields. You're building up biomass. You're not disturbing the soil, and the water you do apply enters much more readily, goes much more efficient in terms of penetrating the soil. So that's another case in point where by being more resource use efficient, we can also be more productive and more profitable. And the great thing that I like to say about climate-smart agriculture is that the things we want to do are generally for this resource use efficiency, which is so important, regardless of the resource. Could be talking about fertilizer use efficiency and preventing groundwater contamination or runoff into fisheries. We could be talking about fossil fuels. We could be talking about other kinds of energy, pumping water for another fossil fuel issue. Those benefits are all, they're aligned with profitability drivers and environmental drivers. Productivity doesn't have to, it's not productivity versus the environment or profits. They can all go together, and what we find is that they do in most cases. That leads you to make smart environmental and smart economic decisions. Let's see, so finally, regardless of geography, I think resource use efficiency and water being a critical one, it's key. It's good for the environment, it's good for profitability, it's good for climate. When we use water wisely, we help drive profitability and environmental sustainability, and it's great that food security environmental goals are not seen as going together as much as they should be, because there's a lot of direct and indirect ways that they work together. Looking ahead, and then I'll finish. Genetics, drought tolerance, heat tolerance, that has an impact on potential water. Short duration crops, big impact in terms of, say, rice. A shorter duration rice uses a lot less water. It also will give you a ton per hectare more in your following wheat crop because you're avoiding the early onset of heat. So you have to think in terms of a system. That's what farmers do. So even if they give up a little rice yield, they might be gaining a huge amount of wheat yield. Salinity tolerance, things that allow us to try to do reclamation of degraded lands that have, in some cases, been degraded by poor management of water. And then I think also the whole information, data, and modeling area is one where we really have a lot of opportunities going forward, and we can leverage a lot from what's happening in places like California and at UC Davis into what's happening in places like Bangladesh or India or Tanzania. And as I said, hydrology is in its infant stage, but we're learning more. I think the whole area of climate services, which, better weather forecasts, seasonal forecasts can also help us conserve water and reduce risk. And remember, it's not about more crop per drop, it's more profit per drop. And that's very important too. And that's especially important in areas where you're really dependent on irrigation. So I'm summing up, I think scarcity and scarcity brings opportunities that can lead to great innovation, whether you're in California or in India or Africa or wherever. And having said that, that's a positive note, but the other side of that is that we do have to figure this out. I mean, if we don't figure these things out, we're not going to meet the SDGs. We've got 14 years to get to the zero hunger, to triumph over stunting, and to eliminate extreme poverty. So water's a critical part of that.
Thank you so much, Rob. You brought up innovation, and I really like the story of the pump on the back of the motorcycle. I hadn't heard that before. That kind of makes me go back to thinking about some comments you made, Mark, of talking about investment in breeding and crop breeding and how that's important. And so I have a question for you, Mark, and it's kind of around just a deeper dive into technologies. So I'm curious is there one technology out there that you really see, not as I know there's no one sort of silver bullet as far as a solution, but is there certain technologies that you're really keeping your eye on and that you see as something that's going to really drive change when it comes to water management?
I wouldn't say one, but I'd say a few related ones, and Rob has touched on those also. One is very cheap pumps, and you're seeing that not only in the Bangladesh case, but also in the Africa case, where there is a lot of shallow groundwater, and pumping from rivers is also another possibility. We've gone through a period where there's the so-called treadle pumps, where people actually pump those. Those seem to be sort of a transitional technology because we're already getting to cases where labor is becoming scarce in Africa as people move off the farm. So I think we're moving away from that model to some extent and into small-scale diesel, electric, and even solar pumps. I think that's one thing that we're looking at, and we're seeing high potential for those in parts of Africa as well. So I think that's one key thing. I think, building on the sort of informatics that Rob also introduced, is that understanding really at a very tiny scale within farms how you're using water, how you're using fertilizer, is becoming possible and even economically feasible. It's still got a ways to go on the smallest farms, but you're seeing it spreading widely. And it's very simple, moisture sensors or nutrient sensors that can be put in the ground and tied to smaller scale GPS systems through cell phones and so forth. And I think that's going to be a revolutionary technology as we move forward as well.
Thomas, a question I have for you is, I'm really struck by thinking about what if we keep going the way we're going, and if the groundwater continues to be depleted, not only what that means for American farmers, but just for daily life. My brother lives in Southern California, so what's going to happen to his garden? But I'm thinking through, too, what are some of whether it's the policy, but also economic incentives that are out there to perhaps create better, promote better efficient use. So have you seen any economic incentive programs that are good practices or things that we can learn from to help, whether it's local or regionally or globally, really push people and force them to use water better?
I have not seen large economic incentives program for that in California, but I think it goes much more into a different direction, and that's the one that Mark touched on, which is to create firmer water rights that allow for tradability, to set a very clear target for the resource pool as a whole, and to set very strong rules of engagement in terms of who gets to sell how much water, and then creating economies around, do I want to use that water to create a crop, or do I want to sell that water and maybe do something else? But for that something else, I think we're still in a place of open creative thinking. And I think that's perhaps one of the largest challenges, which is, can we think about alternative livelihoods for some? This is not going to be farming en gros. This is not even half of farming, but some of the farming. Is there an alternative livelihood there that is not water dependent in those regions that are essentially overdrafting their water resource? And I think it has to be a combination of both markets and creating good markets, and at the same time being creative in thinking about what is it going to take in terms of education, in terms of capacity building, in terms of incentives program to provide actually alternative sources of income.
Great, thank you. I'm actually going to go ahead and turn to the audience now. If you have a question, please raise your hand. And where you're coming from, and you can either direct your question directly to a particular panelist, or maybe it's a round. Well, we'll do a round of 3 before we let the panelists respond. Ellen?
Hi, I'm Ellen Levinson. I'm a consultant. The one issue I just love to hear all of your opinions on is recharging, replenishing aquifers and groundwater, and also recycling, which has become a huge issue, for example, in urban areas and peri-urban. And so I just like to hear some of your thoughts on that, because it's all integrated, how you use surface water, groundwater, and then of course, the urban, rural push-pull kind of situation. So I'd love to hear your input on that. Thank you.
Great. Thanks. Right here. Right here.
Hi. Oh, excuse me. Taylor Winkleman. Yeah, it is. I'm a AAAS Congressional Science Fellow this year, and my question is for all 3 of you. All 3 of you presented very interesting solutions to challenges, and as a California native, I very much appreciate all of those solutions. But I was wondering if you 3 could sort of put your heads together and talk about the implications of if all 3 of you adopted all of those solutions, if Californians started adopting the double legume strategy or the short crop strategy in addition, how much greater of an impact would we have, and what would it take to get all of those solutions together to get genetically modified crops to Malawi, et cetera?
Thanks. We can take one more question. Let's go ahead and go over here to Sarah. Yeah.
I'm Sarah Tisch. I'm from Crown Agents USA, and I was really intrigued with Dr. Bertram's comment on potable water and was sort of waiting for a connection to the other things you were saying, because I think it's rather critical when you get down to the individual, but also extends outward throughout the whole agricultural value chain as soon as, well, on farm and then as soon as you leave the farm. So I'm wondering if you could comment on that, and especially reflecting to the comments about effective legislation and management that Dr. Hartner mentioned. Thank you.
Go ahead and, as the panelists respond to that, Rob, do you mind going first for the question directed to you, as well as if you want to respond to the other comments? Thanks.
Yeah, thanks for that. And you're right. I flagged it and said it's in the bill, but we're in a little bit of an infancy stage in terms of really understanding how to leverage very significant investments from the Water for the Poor Act, the Paul Simon Act, to the food security issue and vice versa. And I think clearly when we set up our irrigation effort, the small scale irrigation, the real focus was on trying to get water. And we didn't really want to set the bar that high at that point, because these are communities where they tend maybe have drinking water now perhaps, but they don't have water for agricultural uses. And but we certainly want to do no harm in there. But I think now we're going to try to push it to the next step. But I guess I would say stay tuned, and we've been reaching out to colleagues in USAID, in the Bureau for Global Health, and in our Environment, Economic Growth, and Education Bureau, and we will be working to advance our efforts in that area.
Rob, is there any other comments you want to make on the recharging or combining of solutions, or we can come back to you, but just.
Well, I was intrigued by the comment about, well, how could we put some of these things together? It's probably happening in ways we don't see. The diversification of agriculture through perennials and the adoption of drip irrigation, whether you're in California or Asia or Africa, it is happening. Often driven by value, but also driven by water scarcity and needing to use that most profit per drop, not most crop per drop strategy, I think, is driving a lot of that. And also just in terms of the other kinds of things, absolutely. I mean, we're investing heavily on things like drought-tolerant maize. But we also want to align that with legume technologies and such, like the ones I described, that are going to make that a much more productive system than just dealing with the drought issue. You have to deal, with that soil fertility issue and really get the synergies.
Thank you, Rob. Thomas, I know you're excited about the recharging recycling to reading your stuff.
Excited about all these questions. These are excellent questions, and all these questions really play into why I'm also very excited about the progress that I'm seeing in California, both on how we deal with groundwater management, and how we deal with water quality, because they all play together. And I'm going to use your question on the recharge a little bit as a plug-in for that. So recharge is going to be the key solution that a lot of our groundwater sustainability agencies will be looking at in trying to figure out ways to balance their banking account. Call your groundwater a banking account. You need to balance it at the end of the day. What goes in has to be over the intermediate long-term range, not more than or not less than what goes out. And so if you're currently in a place where you're drawing more out than you're putting in, then the first thing that people will look for, because it doesn't impact their economic use of the groundwater, is to increase the amount of recharge. And one of the sort of complexities of groundwater is that we have in places where we have a lot of surface water transported to places for irrigation. The Central Valley, a lot of our coastal basins in California, the same can be said in some places in China, or where you have rivers coming from one place of the watershed, flows to another place in the watershed being used for irrigation. We've lost some of that recharge in an attempt to do better agriculture. When we go to micro and sprinkler irrigation in an attempt to be more water use efficient, and then also in a very honest and important attempt to actually control the nitrate and pesticide and salt fluxes into groundwater. In the process of doing that, we have lost some of the recharge that we have come to depend on over the last 40 or 50 years while these very inefficient irrigation systems have been going on. And I don't want to make an argument that we need these inefficient irrigation systems, quite on the contrary. But we need to have a paradigm shift when we think about recharge, thinking about decoupling some of that recharge in inefficient irrigation systems and having a very efficient irrigation system for nutrient use efficiency purposes, for water use efficiency purposes, but also using that same landscape potentially, and this is something that we're looking at in California at relatively large scales, using that landscape to do recharge when we have water available for that recharge that would otherwise be flowing out to the ocean. And it's holding some promise, and there's a lot of research going into what would the water rights situation need to be for capturing these flood flows, what would the infrastructure need to be for these flood flows, how much extra recharge is there available, and then when you look at that agricultural landscape, how would you do that without flushing pesticides and nutrients into groundwater with that recharge, because that's going to be an important part to take care of. So recharge is going to be very important in capturing those local water flows that occur erratically and banking them rather than having them flow by. A lot of folks will be looking at ways to do that now that we haven't done for 50 years, increasing floodplain recharge, maybe going back to floodplains in ways we haven't seen them for a long time. And so recharge is an important piece. Recharge also connects us to the water quality piece. As I said, and this goes back to the drinking water comment that you made. If you look at our agricultural rural communities, they are the communities that are most likely to rely on groundwater for drinking water. As soon as you go out of the community and you go out into rural residents, they are relying on groundwater. That's their source of drinking water. 90% of domestic non-public water supplies in the United States are groundwater wells. And so there is a direct linkage between the groundwater quality impacts that agriculture has and the water quality that we see on these farm wells. Nitrate is a huge issue throughout our agricultural regions that we are beginning to address in California, both on the side of the consumer in the short term, because the groundwater can't be fixed quickly, but for a long-term solution also on the side of how we manage our fertilizer and our pesticides and especially our manure. The question about the solutions that we all three have is that wouldn't that be the hit? That's part of why I'm excited about the approach that California is taking. What's underlying both the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and the approach that I see with some of the water quality regulatory agencies, which are regionalized in California, is they are engaging stakeholders and allowing local stakeholders to say how they want to do it and provide stakeholders with an opportunity to have ownership in understanding the problem, the water quality problem, and how it links to land use, to agricultural practices, but then also devise solutions on how to address that. And to the degree that we are now linking Sustainable Groundwater Management Act and water quality regulations, a lot of this is coming together, and it allows local folks to make these linkages and bring a variety of solutions into their particular place, solutions that work best for the local situations. And I think there's opportunities And those opportunities need to be facilitated, and there's a lot of technical capacity and informational structure that needs to be built to really make that happen effectively.
Thank you, Thomas. Mark?
Yeah, just very briefly, on this sort of integrated approach to try to bring solutions, I guess I'm becoming a little more optimistic, but sort of optimistic because of difficult reasons. That I think the fact that water scarcity is getting so much more severe in key parts of the world. You know, we see California, but you're also seeing that in northern India, northern China, even the dry seasons of places like Indonesia, where water is very plentiful. Also, that's driving the search for integrated and innovative solutions. On top of that, this sort of current political economy that's driven this kind of high cost, high waste water systems that we see in much of the world is breaking down, I think, because the cost has just become too high. And if you look at places like India, the amount of the budget that goes to energy, fertilizer, and water subsidies is so high that it's driving out investments in education, in rural roads, in health and sanitation. So I think the realization is coming that these are just simply unsustainable approaches. So that then drives you to start looking for these kinds of solutions that you mentioned and that we've talked about. On top of that, you are getting more of these sort of scale-appropriate technologies available. So there's solutions for huge farmers, but there's also solutions that now work for smaller farmers through different scales of technology. So I think the setting is there that we can actually make some significant improvements in getting these integrated approaches in place.
Let's take another round of questions from the audience. We have one right up here in the very front. Well, since we had 3 ladies last time, we'll do the man in the white shirt.
Thank you. Great. Thank you for these great presentations. My name is Rutger, and I work for the World Resource Institute, and we work on the water team and also on the aqueducts. That's a global water risk information tool, and I see some faces, and actually there was a quote in the opening, so thank you for that. One of the key challenges, and we acknowledge the huge importance of groundwater, and so I have a question for Thomas. I have a question about the groundwater, because we currently struggle with understanding like where and how much groundwater around the world, where it's declining, where it's increasing, where it's okay, where there's like high risks with groundwater. And one of the key things is we can either measure or model, and I would love to see your perspective on how we can better understand like groundwater on a global scale.
Thanks. Right here.
John Schnitker, excuse me. John Schnitker, I'm with the World Food Program, Iraq Country Office. I think I'll skip Iraq with a broader question about the scalability of irrigation technology. If to go a little bit deeper into that, it's my understanding that farm size in Africa is decreasing. And when you talk about scalable solutions, you know, we're really talking about, you know, market-driven decisions based upon profitability. And the second part is to move this from Kansas to Nebraska and Kansas and talk for a moment about the Ogallala. And it's put it into context. You have, let's call them lower value crops, corn, wheat, sorghum. There's a policy dimension to this in, we'll just say the word ethanol, and you know, groundwater depletion, sustainability, all come into play.
Thank you, John. Is there a question from the back? I want to make sure that our folks in the overflow room, yes, go ahead.
Hi, I'm from the Department of Agriculture, and I had a question about urbanization, since exports make up a big part of food security in many parts of the world. And so I was wondering if the panel members could talk a little bit about how they see water security impacting the major players who are right now providing a lot of the food for the world's population, and how hopeful you are for the ability to adapt and innovate and maybe touch back to the original comments about new technologies and consumer acceptance.
Thank you so much. And I'm going to say one last question, because this will be our last round. So if anyone else has a burning comment or question, raise your hand now or never. Okay, one more. Let's do right here in the center. Good news is we have an awesome reception afterwards, so if you do have questions or comments, you can talk about them then. Go ahead.
Thanks so much. I'm Diana Olbaum, an independent consultant. And, so much of the discussion has really revolved around crops and irrigation, and I'm really interested in the impact on water scarcity of animal, raising animals, and how meat supplies and so forth are going to have an impact on that. So thank you.
Great, thank you, Diana. All right, let's go the reverse that we did last time. So Mark, that means you get to start on whichever parts you'd like to comment on.
Okay, let me touch on a couple. One is the scalability issue. Yeah, I think, as you said, in many areas of Africa, there are still some declining farm sizes, and other areas it's maybe increasing slightly. So what I think is going to be, if you call it a solution or the adaptation that's going to help bring scalable technology, is that you're already seeing a movement towards contracting services to these smaller farms, either direct contracting of an individual who goes around with their harvesting machine or the kind of pumps that Rob was talking about on a piece basis, but also you're seeing consolidation of the operations of the farms. Not the ownership stays small, but you're seeing consolidated ownership. That's happened rapidly in Asia, and it's beginning to happen in parts of Africa. I think that is going to be necessary to get the kind of scalability that you're talking about. On urbanization, yeah, that's a huge challenge, and it's a challenge in interesting ways. It does put a lot more pressure on urban systems where the potential to have contaminated water and accessing poor sources of water. It's also, to me, a slight cautionary work about the use of recycled wastewater. That also can be a high threat to people, particularly children in urban areas, if it's not done right. So I think it has great potential, but maybe has to be done more carefully than it would be. Another issue is that rapid urbanization is actually bidding water away from agriculture. And I think that's one of the other fundamental reasons why I think we need to have a market-based approach where farmers are compensated for water. But you often just get huge amounts of water expropriated from irrigation systems and transferred to urban areas, especially when there's shortages. So arranging those kinds of transfers in an equitable way is another challenge arising from urbanization.
A number of really good questions. On the urbanization piece, there's sort of the flip side of that. If you look at smaller rural communities, and we've seen that in California, where because of the economically disadvantaged situation that these poor communities have, they're actually not being able to compete for water resources, and they're seeing their wells go dry while farmland around their communities is being irrigated, and that's an issue that has partly driven the passing of the Sustainable Groundwater Management Act in California. So there is that competition, and I think Mark is right with his comments on that. On your question of measuring and monitoring, that's to me, that's the most fascinating one. As being a groundwater hydrologist and really kind of getting my head into what's happening with our groundwater system, it's fascinating. And having done extension for 20 years in groundwater hydrology to water districts and locals and primarily in the agricultural community, I also realize there's a huge educational component to that. And my hope is that with this local management that we're embarking on in California, there are opportunities created. And I don't know that we have the capacity to really meet those opportunities. That's really the bigger challenge. To sit down together and educate ourselves, and it's a two-way street, about understanding how groundwater works, what trends have been, understanding
the uncertainty that's associated with understanding groundwater, and that it's not a piece that we can measure precisely. We can't measure how much groundwater flows from one district to another district in sort of as underflow, which is going to become an important part of all of the negotiations that are going to be happening. Understanding uncertainty, understanding how this groundwater system works, but then for me also to understand what are people actually after, what is driving them, and what information do they need to know, and what can I convey to them as a scientist, as an educator, to help them understand how that system works in an effort ultimately to come up with effective monitoring networks of whatever kind, whether it's measuring water levels, that's sort of the most basic one. But when you start talking about measuring the impact of groundwater pumping and groundwater use on surface water in an irrigated landscape, that's a whole different ballgame, and it becomes much more complicated very quickly. And yes, we're struggling with this, and this has been pointed out as a key issue when you go to the global scale. You know, the data are not available. Understanding what that means locally is complicated, and the call for doing more monitoring, having best management practices around monitoring, measurement, and assessment, and including transparency in that is very important. And the transparency piece is important because it goes back again, the decisions go back to local stakeholders. And if the data aren't transparent and people are making decisions based on data that they only hold to themselves, you get all of the political complications from that that come from it. I wanted to point out a really good movie speaking to some of these consequences that we have from that you also spoke of. You know, what happens in southern Central Valley when there's overdraft? What happens on the Ogallala Aquifer in Kansas when there's overdraft? There's an excellent movie by Ian James who's produced this film called Pumped Dry, The Global Crisis of Vanishing Groundwater. It's a very personal film. It tells the story in India. It tells stories from India, from Morocco, from Peru, from the Ogallala Aquifer in Kansas, and from California. Many different angles to all of these issues that we're actually talking about today in a very, very personal way. And it's a fascinating and incredibly well done sort of look forward to what the implications are of this vanishing resource, where it is vanishing. And then I wanted to make a final point, and I'm glad you brought it up, Diana, on animal ag and food consumption. There are many different, we have huge challenges in the two of you can talk about this much better than I can in terms of securing global food production for having 10 billion people in 30 or 40 years. And the fact that not only does food production increase by 30% because we're increasing population by 30%, but it's probably increasing by 70% because Asia is moving into a much more of a meat diet than they used to, and other continents are as well. And there's 2 points I want to make on that. One is thinking about what foods we consume, nutritious foods that may be less water intensive, maybe mixing in more greens or more pulses, more of the nutrient of the protein, high protein vegetables in lieu of meat. Not to go vegetarian necessarily, but to make a conscientious effort to have more nutritious foods that are also less water and nutrient intensive, and kind of backing us off that animal agriculture track. And I'm maybe stepping into a glass house here or something, is one thing. And I think the other piece that goes with this is we've talked about regulations and management practices and governments getting engaged and local governments getting engaged. But there's something about the consumer and the power of the consumer. And so educating our consumers about the implications of their food choices on water scarcity and water quality, I think is important, because that in turn can then also drive sustainable agriculture.
Thank you.
First on scalability, the information that I talked about, for farmers knowing the prices in the capital city and so forth, that has been incredibly powerful leveler in terms of the middleman no longer has the power he or she once had. And instead, I think it's helped induce small-scale producers to seek to aggregate their production and to work in ways that they can become more of a reliable supplier to market demand opportunities that they are now more aware of, and they can also tell those opportunities what they have to offer. So it's helped increase their power, and from our perspective, it's huge because it's about linking small-scale, lower-income producers to market opportunities, which can be transformational in many ways, as Mark described. The meat discussion, animal source foods, that's a really hard discussion to have at the global level. I was at Chatham House in the UK, and everybody was saying how we had to eat less meat and all this. And I said, we're trying to figure out how to get more animal source foods into the diets of the poor. I mean, there's a lot of people in the world that are micronutrient deficient, and it's part of the stunting problem. And we need to get kids milk and eggs and fish and meat. And so, it's about quantity, and it's about how you do it. And of course, we're not talking about big feedlots and grain-intensive systems. Not at all. But we are trying to figure out how to increase the productivity of those pastoralists in a climate-friendly, but also hopefully an income and nutrition-friendly way for the communities in which they work. We're trying to figure out how to get goats and sheep and chickens into these smallholder systems by having a little water that allows them to be more diverse. So it's sort of where you are on that trajectory, and I think we just have to bear that in mind when we think about global issues. Not everybody is dealing with the same situation, and certainly these people are not the ones that have been driving the negative externalities that we all know too well in places like the United States and Europe. On urbanization, I think it's a huge opportunity overall. Because of the wealth that's concentrated there and the demand that generates for a broader diversity of higher value commodities. Also, remember, urbanization is not just about megacities, right? It's occurring all over in smaller scale cities. And you get peri-urban agriculture growing up around that tends to be more diversified, more knowledge intensive. There are environmental issues because it's also more input intensive, so you have to, it has to be managed well. But I think overall, that is a really positive thing for the agricultural community to not only improve its own situation and reduce poverty and stunting, which still concentrate, by the way, in the rural areas. Extreme poverty and stunting are most concentrated in the rural areas. But also provide people in urban settings, particularly the low-income people in those settings, with a greater supply of affordable, quality, and nutritious foods. Finally, on the Ogallala, I'm glad Secretary Glickman's in the room, so I'm sure he'll have something to say about that.
Thank you all for such thoughtful questions. Let's give a huge round of applause for our panelists. Not yet. Secretary Dan Glickman is such a strong and an important voice in the food security community that many of you in this room probably already know him. For those of you that haven't heard him speak before, I assure you that you will remember him well after today. Secretary Glickman served for 18 years as a member of Congress representing the 4th Congressional District of Kansas in the U.S. House of Representatives, which is one of the reasons why he is so good at his current role as the head of the Aspen Institute Congressional Program, where he works to educate members of Congress on why it is important for the United States to invest in global health, global food security, and nutrition. Secretary Glickman is also the co-chair of the Global Food and Agriculture Program at the Chicago Council on Global Affairs, who's been a great partner to our program. And of course, I would be remiss not to mention that he served as the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture for 6 years, where he worked on issues ranging from farm conservation programs to food safety to trade regulations. Secretary Glickman, it is an honor to have you speak at CSIS. Thank you for being here.
I want to, first of all, thank you, CSIS and the University of California, Davis and Josette, for your leadership. The 3 great presentations. I recall some of you have heard me tell the story before about the 2 dairy cows that are grazing along the side of the road, and all of a sudden a milk truck drives by, and on the side of the truck is written in big red letters, pasteurized, homogenized, vitamin enriched, good for you. And one dairy cow looks at the other dairy cow and says, kind of makes you feel inadequate, doesn't it? So you 3 guys that make me feel inadequate. But let me first start out by saying, in addition to my roles at the Chicago Council, some of you have come to our symposiums, which have talked about all these issues. I'm also the chairman, at least for the time being, on the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, which was created in the last Farm Bill as a fund for innovative, off-the-wall, out-of-the-box solutions to problems like water. So if you look it up online on the Foundation for Food and Agriculture Research, the Congress appropriated $200 million to put in this fund. Secretary Vilsack appointed a board, which I'm the current chairman of. We're looking for projects. We got $200 million in the bank. Now, they have to be matched. So it's just not a grant. You got to come up with some of the resources yourself to do it. But on innovative things that might deal with some of these issues, and water and climate-related issues and nutrition are big parts of this. So folks in this room who are interested really ought to be looking at it. We can partner with governments, with the private sector, with universities, with just about anybody. So there is an opportunity to take what you talked about and develop it. I also thought it's kind of interesting. Monday night is this big debate, okay, between I don't know who and I don't know who. But it might get the biggest listening audience since the Super Bowl, okay? And I'm reminded that in 1960, or 56 years ago, there was a famous debate between John Kennedy and Richard Nixon. And at that debate, they were each given 8 to 10 minutes to talk about their view of the world. And they talked about America's role in the world. They didn't talk about the size of their hands, or they didn't talk about, they didn't talk about building walls. The very first question after their 8 to 10 minutes was on farm policy. Now imagine that. Could you imagine that today? People asking a question about farm policy? John Schnitker from Kansas? I only mention this point because the issues you talked about are so powerfully important to the future of the world. Not only just the future of agriculture, but the future of the world. And somehow we got to drive these issues higher in our national debate. Issues of hunger, food security, weather variability, climate change, feeding a hungry world that's growing in big numbers, dealing with poverty and stunting, worldwide, but also in the United States as well. And I doubt if any of these moderators are going to ask any questions about food security. But you know, if you want to ask somebody about what we can do to reduce instability, reduce conflicts, it's a logical thing to do. So it's, I think, our jobs, your jobs in this room, to try to drive this and recognize it's not getting in politics for politics' sake. It's getting into politics for policy's sake, to get people who want to lead this country, whoever they are, Republican and Democrat, to focus on the issues that we're talking about, that they're not unimportant, that they are going to drive the world over the next many years. I spent some time in the motion picture industry, and I like to quote movies all the time. And so the famous movie, The Graduate. Some of you remember the father-in-law of Dustin Hoffman, who had the very secret sauce for the future of the world. Remember what that was? Plastics. Today, the word is water. It really is. I mean, there are a lot of other parts of agriculture, but water is literally the lifeblood of being able to grow and raise and feed it. And we've got a real problem for a lot of different reasons in different parts of the world caused by different things, but they are solvable problems. These are not, listening to you folks, I think we've got most of the solutions here in one form or another. But I'm just telling you that the secret word is not plastics anymore. And then I think you raised the point about the consumer. I forgot which of you talked about the consumer. Somebody once asked me, what is the most powerful force in agriculture today? Who is the most powerful force? You know, as I'm thinking, is it Texas A&M? Is it Monsanto? Is it whatever it is? Well, in my judgment, the most powerful force in agriculture today is Walmart. Now, it's not Walmart per se, it's the Walmarts of this world, who are being driven by consumers in large part to change their buying habits, to be much more interested and concerned about how food is produced and what's in it and where it comes from and what its environmental impact is and how people are treated, labor who grow it and raise it and do these kinds of things. And that is a powerful, you talk about incentives. Those are real incentives, much greater than even what the government or governments can really do. I'm not saying that there isn't a great role for governments, particularly state and local governments, and for collaborations, private sector. USDA, in my years there, did a great job and continues to do a great job in the conservation area. USAID has done this remarkable job worldwide in building these kind of collaborative events. But realizing who has the power to make the changes. And that power is more and more in the hands of consumers and also in the hands of these kinds of devices, as long as you don't have a Samsung that's turned on so the battery will burn a hole in your pocket. Because every flight attendant in the world is now talking about that when you fly anywhere. So I think that that is another point. Another point, and I basically mentioned this before, is the relationship between water scarcity, agriculture and development, and national security. It's a pleasure to speak on this topic in the halls of one of the premier think tanks in the world on national security. That's your sweet spot. And how water and food are critically connected to national security of the United States, but national security of the Middle East, of the Jordan River, of Yemen. I mean, you think of South Asia, as we've talked about, all these things. And I mean, scarcity of any resource anywhere around the globe can have profound impacts on national security. We've lived through 50 years of petroleum being the resource. But we're now learning that there are alternative energy sources, and the availability and supply of energy is changing rather dramatically. And so, but how all of what you're talking about is so key to prevention of political and economic crises in this country. Another point I want to talk about has to do with infrastructure. And this isn't just infrastructure in the context of irrigation. So my wife's from Detroit. I spent a lot of time in Michigan, so Flint, Michigan is a big factor. And in talking with people I know at University of Michigan, they tell me that we lose, the numbers are not very good here, but we lose between 10 to 20% of all water that goes through pipes in this country every year, because the pipes are so old, the leakage is so great, that it dwarfs the amount of water that we use in many cases in agriculture. And we're all in this together. And after the Flint thing happened, I thought to myself, boy, if there was ever a reason why this country needed to dramatically increase its investment, not just in bridges and roads, which we do, and the electric grid and the energy power system, which we do, but water and sewer systems, because most are ancient in this country. It's going to cost $1 trillion to redo them. And the more pressure there is in urban areas to pay more for water, or not to have water, or to have dirty water, or water that's impacted with lead or mercury or other contaminants, the more pressure on agriculture to either reduce the water that they use or change it rather directly. So, I mean, all of this tells us how we just have to be smarter about all this stuff. And U.S. development and international agriculture and food aid is actually more important than ever. And I will have to tell you that USAID has done this remarkable job under the leadership of your prior director, and I think the current one as well. It's been transformational in terms of what we can do and what we can't do in terms of trying to help people help themselves. In some cases, become more food self-sufficient. In other cases, rely on each other to do a better job. But a confluence of global events is putting our national security at risk from non-traditional threats, and certainly one of those threats is the water thing. And I want to make another point, and it's somewhat political. I can do that. I understand you three may have problems doing that. But this concept of America disengaging from the world is a very dangerous concept. I understand that not every trade agreement in the world is perfect. Not everybody's a winner and all these kinds of things. But we cannot influence the world on political and non-political types of things, including research, if we choose to go it alone, if we choose to withdraw. And that may not seem to have as much impact on agriculture, but we have been the leader in dealing with chronically hungry people. There's still a lot out there, 850 million or so, although we've made progress in that area. And 2 billion people suffer from micronutrient deficiencies. And by 2025, as many as 1.8 billion are expected to live in water-scarce conditions. And the effects of weather-related events due to extreme weather, volatile weather, climate change, all of those things will only exacerbate those problems. So the United States of America doesn't have to be the sole leader. We're not the exclusive power. But we have a role that no other country in the world seems to want to, or has the ability or the inclination to pick up the slack and do these things. That's why what you're doing at UC Davis or the many other great schools in this country with appropriate research dollars, because of course our research in agricultural spending has been flat, in large part because we talk to ourselves and we don't make this a national security issue. We don't bring in other segments of the Defense Department or other places where we kind of can tell people that this is an important situation that we find ourselves in. The other thing that I wanted to point out as another theme has to do with this rural-urban issue. And you spoke about this, one of you spoke about this. So where are people moving to? Well, in most places in the world, they're moving to cities. And in some places, they're moving in droves into cities. I was in China last month, and we were talking about the production of food, how they're going to do it, what they're going to buy from overseas, what they can produce locally, and what they're doing to their natural resources and to their soil, because soil health is such a key factor in absorption of water and being able to grow adequate amount of crops. The politics in this country is that most people live in urban and suburban areas. Only 1.5% of the people live and work on farms. And only about 7 or 8% of the people live in congressional districts that have a significant amount of agriculture. So out of the 435 congressional districts in America, 35 or so are agricultural districts. 405 or 400 are not. So you tell me who's going to benefit when there's a crisis or a clash between people in cities or urban areas or in businesses or industrial people who need water, and in rural areas where the pressure is so great and we need so much water, because right now we use close to 70% of the fresh water to grow crops. I mean, those numbers are not sustainable unless we make some of the changes that you will talk about. So not only will other nations clash on these issues, internally in the United States, people are going to clash on these issues. Now, the good news is that Congress has worked in some cases on a bipartisan basis to pass bills like the Global Food Security Act, the Water for the World Act, the Electrify Africa Act. Actually, there's a lot of bipartisanship when it comes to global development issues. I think a lot of it had to do with Raj Shah, a lot of it had to do with the president, but a lot of it had to do with the Republican leadership on the committees in Congress who really took the lead in moving some of these issues. Just as a side note, I was in Tanzania 3 years ago, and a man came up to me. It has nothing to do with water, but you'll get my point. And it was outside a USAID office. And he said to me, he says, "You're American?" "Yeah." I mean, I kind of look like an American. And he said, "You have the 3 greatest people in the world in your country. You know that?" And I said, "Who are they?" And they said, "They're Barack Obama, Bill Clinton, and George W. Bush." And I said, "Well, I'm not sure I could find 10 people in America who would say that." And so I said, "Why?" And they said, "Well, Bill Clinton has really taken on Africa and through all the work that he's done in foundations and personal work, and he's kind of a personal hero around the world. Barack Obama, similarly, but is obviously a son of Africa, and created an image for our country that was really positive in the developing world. But this guy said, your guy, George W. Bush, actually did more than anybody else." And I said, "Oh, really?" He says, "Yeah, because he and his team led an effort that saved millions of lives in tuberculosis control, malaria, AIDS, and those kinds of things." All I'm saying to all of you here as we talk about issues like water, American leadership is unequaled in the world, and we can't let that fall down the rat hole. And that means American leadership politically, it means American leadership at the university level, it means American leadership at the private sector level, because what I found is as companies are all sorts of companies are now seeing it in their interest for a lot of different reasons to get active in these areas. So what specifically can we do, I think, to deal with these issues? And I'm going to repeat a little bit of what you just talked about. First issue is weather volatility. I tell you, the word climate change is overused. It's a great issue, but it's an issue at 35,000 feet. Nobody knows what it means other than climate's changing. It's hotter than it used to be, or it's colder than it used to be. So I say, well, you got to drill down into climate change, into short-term issues like weather volatility, intense rainfall events, intense droughts, floods, natural disasters. It's clearly being caused by a changing climate. But no issue is more dependent on predictable weather than agriculture, and weather and climate will challenge our ability to meet the food demands of the world's growing population by making food production unstable and exacerbating agriculture, diseases, and pests. It's all already happening over the world, and some of the most important crops in the world, like wheat, are particularly susceptible to this kind of thing. We must make sure that climate-smart agriculture is incorporated into all aspects of international agriculture development. Second, science and research plays a crucial role in our ability to conserve water, have higher water use efficiency, and gain productivity going forward. Scientific research has allowed us to develop new technologies to strive to meet needs like, one, new irrigation technologies, which, as we've heard today, irrigated lands are more productive and less vulnerable to weather-related shocks. And we've had some success in this area, including leveling of fields, which allow water to flow evenly, surge flooding, where water is released at prearranged intervals, which reduces runoff, capture and reuse, which we talked about a little bit before, drip irrigation, which of course was an Israeli-developed concept, but it's used, in many other parts of the world. In addition, we have seen some success in breeding for new highly water-efficient crop plants, which incorporate drought tolerance or salinity resistance or tolerance. And we have seen some positive results in the use of soil moisture promoting practices such as conservation tillage and cover crops, which you all talked about. I think the whole area of desalinization is still almost an untouched area. I know that it takes a lot of energy to take seawater and convert it into water that's usable. But when you look at all the scientific challenges that are out there in the medical world, in the industrial world, in the technology world, this is a challenge that seems to be ripe for a much heightened understanding and ramp up on the research agenda. But the bottom line here is the monies that go into agriculture research are inadequate. In real terms, they're falling. That wasn't true at the NIH. That wasn't true at the Department of Defense. That wasn't true at the National Science Foundation, although they're not going up in the same way that they used to. So making the case that agriculture research is important to the future of the world is something that we have to figure out how to message better. Through integrated approaches to development, the United States government can leverage U.S. leadership in university research and development on agriculture and water linkages to create. Water is not just an issue abroad. Increasing demands for water and agriculture are also growing within the United States due to drought and other environmental changes. And water contamination from agriculture runoff continues to be a major issue that is always under regulatory scrutiny. And there are a lot of positive things happening on the collaborative side of the picture as well. We've talked about the California situation, but the use of big data and other on-farm information systems can be used to help develop better monitoring of water resources, water quality, and risks. But more policies on protecting farmers' privacy while being able to use their on-farm data are critical. I was in a meeting 2 days ago where I met with the person at Google in charge of agriculture. Now imagine, Google. And what this person does is he's created a data stream where with crowdsourcing, he's able to get information from people all over the country, and they're going to go worldwide with this, to share practices on how to improve yields and the simple things. For example, like buying seeds. They find that most farmers, once they get a vendor, they stay with the vendor irrespective of what the cost of the seeds are. And so crowdsourcing can be an effective way of getting people information to improve their income. More incentive programs are needed to encourage the uptake of water efficient and water risk resilient technologies, and existing ones need improvement. And the concept of GMOs, which was talked about earlier today, GMOs and their follow-on technologies are really an important way that water use efficiency will be embedded into new crop varieties. Those issues have to be raised. They're very controversial, but there's just no way around it. It has to be done intelligently and well regulated. So it's clear that there is no time for complacency. In fact, one could argue that this is as crucial of a time for global food security as we've seen since 2007 and 2008. And we know that agriculture development creates income for farmers and ranchers and small communities all over the world, that alleviates poverty. It provides economic opportunities for producers overseas and for U.S. producers and businesses. And we know that global food security helps protect our U.S. national security. We also know that an increasing population coupled with climate risks will further strain already strained water resources. So the challenges are great, but I think that with good minds and thoughtful leadership and with public pressure and consumer pressure, we can get the jobs done. I always am reminded, and I'm closing with this quote, there's an architect named Daniel Burnham. Anybody ever heard of him in this room? Okay, he built Union Station here. He built the Wrigley Building and the Tribune Building in Chicago, and he was the creator of the Chicago World's Fair in 1896. And he had this quote that has just stuck with me all my life. And it goes like this. It says, "Make no little plans, for they do not have the power to stir men's souls." And you think about this. What you're talking about is big stuff. Now, not everything is going to be solved by a Marshall Plan or a Manhattan Project. I realize that. It takes a myriad of different kinds of solutions from a lot of different people. But what you raised today is a huge, huge problem. As big as really most other problems we face as a world. And the question is that not should we do it, but will we do it? And I hope we can. And thank you all very much.
I told you you'd remember him, right? He's such a great speaker. Thank you so much, Secretary Glickman. Thank you for being here today. I am very happy to say that we have a reception for all of us right outside with food and drink. Please, instead of making your way up to talk to the speakers, please make your way out and we will all be coming out. Thank you all again for coming.